Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Margaret Newell, and I'm a member of the History Department at Ohio State University. I'm here to welcome all of you to this edition of the Center for Historical Research series on anger. And our title today is Anger in the Crowd: Emotion, Contentious Politics, and Collective Action in the Age of the French Revolution. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our distinguished guests, which I'll have to do very briefly because they're so distinguished. They've both written and published so many exciting looking books and articles. I'll just pull a few highlights from their records. So first is Professor Katie Jarvis, who is at the University of Notre Dame, where she is Carl E. Koch Associate Professor of History. Her most recent book was called Politics in the Marketplace: Work, Gender, and Citizenship in Revolutionary France. And it was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. And this book won a number of prizes and honors, including the Louis A. Gottschalk Prize from the American Society for 18th Century Studies. It was a finalist for the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Award for Best First Book. Professor Jarvis's book in progress is called Democratizing Forgiveness: Reconciling Citizens in Revolutionary France, which I hope she'll talk more about today. She's been an ACLS fellow and has also written a number of prize-winning articles. And I actually want to hear about her interview with Lynn Hunt too. I think that was something that jumped out at me. We also are joined by distinguished historian David Andress, who is professor of modern history at the University of Portsmouth. David has written more books than I have written articles. He's a very prolific historian. Perhaps one of his most well-known books is The Terror, focusing on that element of the French Revolution, which was published in 2005. He recently edited a major collection of essays, the Oxford Handbook of the French Revolution. And he's written a number of books and articles about people's experience of the revolution, trying to get at things from the point of view of people who are actually participating at all levels of society. The French Revolution and the People being one of those books. His work in progress, which also has a legal connection, that's something both of our historians have been working on, is a project on the jury system and its introduction into revolutionary France and the idea of reconstructing trust. So we have someone who's looking at forgiveness and someone looking at the reconstruction of trust. And I hope we get to that in our program today. Well, I wanted to start by asking both Professor Jarvis and Professor Andress about what drew them to the idea of anger and emotion in the French Revolution. And perhaps you could, in answering that question, could also discuss a little bit how previous generations of historians, such as Charles Tilly, had thought about anger, if they thought about it at all. Do you want to start, Professor Jarvis?
Sure. I really take an interest in emotions in the French Revolution because, above all, I feel the revolution as a very passionate period, and I'm very interested in the experience of the popular classes, and I find it tremendously fascinating to see how people can be passionate about different aspects of revolutionary politics, but also how emotions get coded according to class, and then how that feeds into the types of political activism that's appropriate for each class to have, how they're allowed to intervene into politics. So, for example, a polished lawyer, right, would be better suited off in the politics and the political discourse of the National Assembly. And their anger might assume very energetic speech denouncing a traitor, but at the same time, there's also parallel anger, for example, in the marketplace over food prices, but that assumes perhaps a grittier form, but that's accepted as that appropriate form of political expression and in fact appropriated by others. So I kind of like the nuance of emotion across the revolutionary experience. That's what's really interesting to me. Want to take it away, David?
Thanks, sure. Well, I think my interest in sort of the emotional life of people living through the revolution goes back to the research I was doing originally for my PhD several decades ago now, and later sort of microhistorical work in the police records, and particularly of the early years of the revolution, and the extent to which what you find in those is a landscape of people who are very heavily engaged emotionally with each other, often in situations of crisis and conflict, where the way that the French police take their records in this period is just a sort of fascinating accumulation of expression and contestation, and these wonderful moments where someone will literally sign something and also say, I don't agree with any of this, you know, and that they certainly, as you read them, they feel like you're able to experience the feelings of people engaged in these things, and that the revolutionary sort of crowd culture, public culture that comes through there also has really strong connections with the public culture of the old regime. And that's one of the things that I think that fascinates me, is thinking about people who've come through from a really very complicated social and cultural environment of the old regime monarchy, and in its relationship to the ordinary people and their needs and expectations, into a revolutionary situation where they have a whole new politics, a whole new political vocabulary sort of thrust on them. And many of them accept it wholeheartedly. Many of them aren't perhaps sure quite what it means, but they're willing to engage and become excited, become passionate, become joyful, become furiously angry at the turmoil of what's going on around them. And I think, you know, we're privileged in some respect to have access to the kind of historical records which let us see all those dimensions of people's emotional and cultural life being expressed through the political crises of the period.
So, you know, there's older literature on both the French Revolution and on crowd actions in general that discusses them as sort of pre-modern events that often were really just seeking for justice within an existing system rather than trying to change the system. So what is different about these angry crowds of the French Revolution? Is anger really a tool of mobilization, or is anger bring legitimacy, or what are some of the ways in which the use of anger and emotion in these contexts is different? You've already suggested it in some of your answers, particularly I think the new political messaging, but maybe both of you could amplify on that topic a little bit.
Yeah, I think as different as the revolutionaries grapple with new questions and new, not just political questions, but also circumstances, whether that's war with much of Europe eventually, right? These new challenges bring anger in new ways that actually circumscribe communities in ways that hadn't been circumscribed under the old regime. So to give that a concrete example, so, for example, when the revolutionaries decide that they're going to try to sell public church state land as and back their new paper currency, they issue a paper currency, but they issue it in like $300 bills, we'll say, just to give a modern equivalent. Well, you can't buy an apple with a $300 bill, right? So if you're in the marketplace and you're an everyday individual and you're a retailer or someone that's selling in small quantities, all of a sudden you share interests with these groups of people that you didn't really share interests before in kind of the corporately delineated guild system of the old regime, in which paper money wasn't a thing. You know, it was more done on credit. And so for the first time, even before, for example, the revolutionary deputies get rid of the guild system and get rid of kind of occupational divisions, you have people through their own anger about the inability to use paper money teaming up with each other in new ways, forming crowds, brokers allying with retailers, retailers allying with clients, and saying, hey, we all need access to money. So the revolution, I think, in some ways creates new sources of anger that also circumscribe communities in new ways that kind of break out of that old box. So I think we also get kind of new social groupings just by way of kind of the extreme situations in which different groups are placed.
Well, David, you had mentioned in an earlier conversation that the revolution is also messing things up and making people angry and helping to create those sorts of connections. Are there some examples from your research at popular anger at what the revolution?
Well, I think one of the interesting things we can observe, and we just think about this as sort of high conceptual level. There is a transfer of sovereignty that goes on in 1789. There's a perception at a lot of different levels that the people or the nation have now become sovereign, and you know, they're not quite sure how to talk about the king in this context because he's also sovereign, but they think that the people have become sovereign, that they've overthrown a system, and that has some really interesting, complicated, and gruesome manifestations that we can think about. if we go back to the old regime for a moment, one of the things we can think about the public culture, the culture of crowds and disturbances is, I mean, as Katie has already alluded to, the concern with the safety of the food supply, the concern with the physical safety of people, protection from threats of starvation, threats of attack, and so on. And that people do genuinely seem to have had a sort of understanding that they had a right to that protection, that this was something that they could be very angry about it being threatened, that they're defensive about their own rights, their own entitlements, their access to food, their access to the sort of means of everyday life. And this translates across the revolutionary rupture with the idea of the famine plot. As a lot of people might know about the revolution, the spiraling price of food through 1789 is one of the elements of the crisis. It's this, massive collision of a high-level political crisis with a really basic food crisis that stimulates the sort of revolutionary situation. And you'll end up, again, emblematically, a week after the fall of the Bastille, with two very senior royal officials, Foulon and Berthier, who've been in hiding, are dragged out of hiding by angry crowds who accuse them of being famine plotters, of having actually been leaders in a really high-level aristocratic conspiracy to destroy the national representation, the Estates General that's been meeting, to destroy Paris in the interests of bringing back a sort of aristocratic tyranny, and to use the food supply to do that. And those two people, Foulon and Berthier, are going to be lynched in central Paris in really gruesome fashion, sort of historically gruesome fashion, as it's recorded by contemporary educated observers. But one of the really interesting things about that is before Foulon dies, the first of the two to die, the crowd that we might think of as this kind of angry, violent, collective expression, the crowd actually takes Foulon to the city hall where the elected representatives are meeting in a municipality, and the crowd tries to get those elected representatives to put Foulon on trial. And the mayor of Paris, Bailly, records in his memoirs this long back and forth between the crowd demanding that various people be named as judge and prosecutor and other officials of a court. And they sort of go along with this process. There's an acceptation that the crowd is entitled to demand semi-formal justice out of this. And what's also happening, of course, is the crowd is doing that. That the proceeding to lynching happens because the Marquis de Lafayette turns up with some armed soldiers and tries to rescue Foulon. And then everything gets very ugly and it turns into a lynching. But before it was a lynching, it was an attempt at a judicial procedure, and the demand for that came from the angry crowd itself, which I think is a really fascinating perspective on, not looking back to older generations who thought that there was a sort of fundamental distinction between emotional, irrational crowd action and the rationality of elite politics, that the boundary between those two things is much more of a blurred overlap in 18th century contexts.
So the crowd's acting in a legitimate way, in a judicial way, in some ways, with that story. Well, what do both of you think about the relationship between anger and violence in the revolution? So, David, the story you just told ended in violence, but it didn't. That was in part because of other interventions.
I think they would have expected him to end up dead, but they wanted him to end up dead by being sentenced to death, which is interesting. I mean, the historian Paolo Viola said many decades ago that the crowds in 1789 decide that they're sovereign, and what they recognize about the idea of sovereignty is the right to punish, and that this is one of the things we're seeing in the revolution, that people in various ways coming out of being agitated, being angry, being frightened, but also being told that the people are now sovereign. They do what the state did. They look for people to punish. And again, thinking about ironies, you can look back to the spring of 1789, when there's an early manifestation of crowd violence. It's called the Réveillon riots, where they trash the factories of a couple of manufacturers who've been accused of saying socially conservative things. And what happens after that is that quite a lot of people are killed by the forces of order in the suppression of the riot. And after the riot, the forces of order basically randomly decide that a few vagrants are guilty and hang them publicly. They literally round up some usual suspects and string them up to make a point. And there is a sense in which that's one of the things you see running through this, the scapegoating people, killing them to make a point is something the old regime did. And there are circumstances where you can think about whether that isn't one of the things that revolutionary crowds have learned to do, that you can make a point by killing someone. And that's not new, that's business as usual. It's just now that right belongs to the people. So there's a very, very interesting, complicated dynamics involved in when protest, assertion turns to anger, turns to violence, turns to deadly violence, is connected to these perceptions of when other boundaries are transgressed, when treason has been committed, when people have been betrayed, when they've been plotted against, when their only recourse is to undo the plot by destroying the plotters. This is a theme that comes back again and again, all the way down through into the terror itself.
So, Katie, did you want to speak to this question too about anger and violence not always being the same thing, or different ways that different targets of popular anger?
Definitely. I think the tricky thing about violence in the revolution too, it's not just about if we're talking about a loose spectrum of acceptable or unacceptable violence. It's not just about intensity. It's about the target, and that target changes oftentimes depending on the circumstance in the revolution. So, for example, we could say in 1791, there's a group of market women go and they round up a whole bunch of nuns who are accused of being counter-revolutionary because they're not allowing their students to confess to pro-revolutionary priests. And so the market women round up these nuns and they literally drag them out of their convents and lift up their skirts and spank them like you would discipline a child. They call it the patriotic discipline in the streets of Paris, throughout the streets of Paris. And people come out and watch. And this kind of violence, this kind of anger is coded okay, right? This is okay in the eyes of the revolutionaries because it's against the counter-revolutionary nuns, right? And the dames de hall are the market women are applauded for this. But then 2 years later, the market women get in a brawl with a women's club that wants price controls that are detrimental to the market women, and they brawl in the marketplace. And now all of a sudden, that same National Assembly that, you know, looked somewhat favorably on the spanking of the nuns looks at this action and they see that as threatening to kind of internal political order over price controls. And they say, well, that violence is bad. And they try to blame it on female irrationality. Well, female irrationality didn't seem to be a problem in the nuns one. So there's this like shifting target as to what type of anger is acceptable, what group it's directed at. And then a third layer, how does that affect the National Assembly and kind of its legislation and its ability to kind of secure the nation. And that determines kind of the what would we want to call like the notable ramifications or the official reaction to that violence. So there seems to be an ever shifting target in the revolution. And it's not just about intensity of violence. It's constantly moving.
So you mentioned that these women, the assembly basically, you know, finds these female crowds useful and legitimate in some points, but you know, in other points, illegitimate. So can you talk a little bit about the way that participation in crowd actions and expressions of anger and so on allow some groups to participate in political activities in ways that they haven't before, but in ways that kind of participation was delimited? Are there other examples, in other words, of points in which the regime decides it wants a monopoly of force, or these crowd actions are illegitimate, or et cetera, that you could think of, or ways in which ordinary men and women had been participating and are marginalized?
Yeah, to kind of pick up on one of David's earlier points, one of the actually the biggest journée, our political crowd demonstration of the revolution, is the October days, when a group of 6,000 to 7,000 women plus some National Guardsmen march out to Versailles to the king, where the king is still living at the beginning of the revolution, and ask him for bread. But kind of going back to David's earlier point, something really interesting happens is that they go to the municipality, the government of Paris at first, and they say, you know, we want you to do something. And when the municipality literally can't convene because the crowds are so large, then they take matters into their own hands. But they try to get the National Guard to go too, because they want the legitimacy of it. So sometimes it's not necessarily that the government, quote unquote, lets them or encourages them, but that it's just, at the end of the day, you know, crowds are numbers, and there's only so much agency that, you know, a small group of men can have over 7,000 popular class men and women who really want to go see the king and are convinced that counter-revolutionary, you know, ministers are controlling his agenda, and that's the problem. And if we just get him away from that, he'll sign the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. He'll support our revolutionary endeavors. We'll get bread. So there's this constant kind of participation in kind of a new vein that David alluded to, but this push and pull between the crowds that don't want to alienate themselves and do believe in kind of the National Assembly as their representation, but also spur the National Assembly to ever, at least in the beginning, ever radical kind of politics in pursuing their goals.
And that kind of thing, I mean, we can, again, if we try to imagine what's going on through these revolutionary years, right from 1789 through to 92, 93, Paris becomes a place where there is a network of essentially continuous public agitation and public activity, sort of starting, you know, just north of what is now the Louvre Museum, in the Palais Royal, which is this absolutely fascinating kind of open public space, open but constrained, with buildings on all sides, which had a reputation before the revolution for free speech, because it was private property. It belonged to the Duc d'Orléans, and the Paris police weren't allowed in there. And it retains that reputation after the revolution, even though the police can go in there now. And there is the Palais Royal Gardens, and then as you move westwards, there's all the area around the Tuileries and the Tuileries Gardens, and there's the area near there where the actual National Assembly is meeting after the October days. It comes from Versailles to Paris. And around all these places, and in the other open spaces, you know, slightly further east, there's the Place de Grève, where the city hall is. These are places where people are accustomed to meeting anyway in their everyday lives, but they become, under revolutionary circumstances, intensely politicized spaces. And what you were saying about this sort of connection with elite politics, one of the things that's going on around the Tuileries and the National Assembly is a constant flow of information from what's being said in the National Assembly via the public galleries, literally kind of game of telephone, down the staircases, into the grounds outside, people constantly talking about what is happening inside, because they understand that it affects their lives, that these are decisions that will shape their existence forever after. And groups getting very agitated and contrary about this. That the Palais Royal in particular is notorious for violent dispute, people getting angry with each other about how to interpret public events. And one of the things that I looked at quite closely in my sort of micro-historical research was the 14th of July, 1790, when you have the Festival of Federation, which is this great bringing together patriotic unity, huge crowds, huge ceremonies taking place, the king and the revolutionary leadership being seen as reconciled. And inside the Palais Royal Gardens afterwards, there are furious arguments and literal fights breaking out over whether or not the king took his oath properly, and whether or not the National Assembly should call him back the next day to take his oath properly. Because, you know, on the one hand, it's vitally important, both symbolically and clearly practically, that people believe the king is actually committed to the revolution or not. And on the other hand, they're prepared to fight each other, that people in National Guard uniforms are drawing their sabres and waving them in the air, threatening to push people into the fountains. You know, there's real kind of violent agitation at the very center of people trying to figure out what has actually happened. Did he take his oath properly or not? They don't No, but they're all prepared to speculate about it because it really matters to them. They are living the revolution emotionally and rationally, intellectually, all at the same time. And what's happening matters enough for them to be in a constant state of agitation and dispute about it.
So were counter-revolutionaries using similar tactics? So in other words, were the various counter-revolutionary revolts, peasant revolts, and the suppression of these revolts, did they also play out in this realm of anger, emotion, and battles for legitimacy? Did the counter-revolutionaries view themselves as engaging in political action, or were they using an older construction of both their legitimacy as crowds and and legitimate emotions and so on?
Katie?
I would say, at least for the Vendée and the region that was heavily most heavily against the revolution for religious reasons, there's also another level of anger, which is the anger over salvation, which really kind of ups the ante if your life is very short on this earth. 50% of people die before the age of 5. The average age, if you live past 5, is 50. So life is really short and awful for most people. So the life you want to look forward to is the next one. And so what happens is the revolution restructures the church so that priests are elected, and this creates a whole problem for people who adhere strongly to the power of the keys, this idea that the power of Christ has to come from the Pope to the bishops to the clergy, or spiritual authority doesn't work. And so those people feel a whole other level of anxiety and anger, because this is not just political to them. This is, how am I going to bury my child and make sure they're not stuck in purgatory? How am I going to get to heaven? If I confess to this priest, am I damned anyways because I didn't get a legitimate pardon? So it's kind of interesting because while that rallies people who have a common concern too, in some senses, that's a very, very personal concern too, in ways that maybe worrying about the king's oath is slightly different from as far as the register of anger and its long-term effects on one's life.
And I think, I mean, we can, you can think about sort of those Parisian crowds and a lot of the peasant majority of the country as living at kind of two ends of a spectrum of how the revolution feels to them, what it feels like it's done. One of the things that's part of the bigger picture of the revolution of 1789 is that it really does, in a sense, begin in the countryside. It begins with a huge wave of civil disobedience of one kind or another from the peasantry, from the winter going into the spring of 1789, because there's been this process of calling together the Estates General, because the country's been asked to write these things called cahiers de doléances, registers of grievances. They've been asked by the king to say what's wrong with the way your life is. And the peasantry in particular have said, well, there's the taxes, they don't work. There's the feudal dues, they don't work and they're horrible. There's the church tithes, they don't work, and we're not getting enough benefits out of what we pay into the church. And once they've declared that these things are abuses, a lot of them then agree as communities, well, they're just not going to pay them anymore. And in that spring of 1789, there is a revolution in the countryside, which causes almost no deaths. I mean, and that's one of the interesting points. It's a revolution of assertions that the peasantry are not going to pay things to the priests, things to the lords, that they're going to put their cattle in whichever damn field they like, that they're going to knock down fences, that they're going to tear up and burn the feudal charters which have been oppressing them for a long time. They're going to open up the granaries in the monasteries and take back the grain, because they too are hungry. They too are suffering the food crisis. And this creates a great sense amongst the rural majority. At least 2/3 of the country are literal peasant agricultural workers of one kind or another. At least 80% of the country is essentially rural. It creates a huge sense amongst them that they have done something which is irreversible. They have liberated themselves. And then one of the problems of the revolution as a political process is it tries to resubjugate that peasant majority to things like paying their taxes properly, paying the tithes of the church until they're replaced, and particularly paying those feudal dues until they redeem them. You end up with a situation where these financial burdens on the peasantry are interpreted as being the valid, legitimate private property of the people who own them. And the peasantry are told, well, if you want to get out from under this, it'll be 20 years payments, please. And it's just an absolute sort of conceptual collision. There is no way on God's earth that those peasants are going to give them a penny. They have ended this system, and the National Assembly can't decide they haven't ended it. So a lot of the countryside, you know, and we know about things like the Great Fear, for example, which happens in the summer of 1789, it's a sort of emblematic moment. But after that, through the years ahead, much of the countryside is stirred up on a regular basis, sometimes with movements covering entire regions, where communities come together and they object to any attempt to resubjugate them to these kind of burdens. And they will attack officials, helping to create a new and very angry tension between urban and rural perspectives on these things. They will attack feudal lords. They will carry on, in some cases, attacking religious institutions as well. But they absolutely will not pay, and they angrily will not pay. And there is a very interesting balancing act then between revolutionary authorities at the center and their ability to command the loyalty of the general population. And the authorities at the center will be gradually forced to give in. And by the summer of 1793, they will have officially given up all attempt at enforcing feudal dues, that the peasantry will have won through their resistance, through their intransigence, you know. But that's been a process of angry confrontation. And again, one of the other interesting things that then spins off from that is how, you know, it's only some parts of the country that carry on resisting central authority into the period of the Terror. France will conduct a mass mobilization, a levy en masse, only a couple of months after that final abolition of feudal dues, and people will respond. The message of national identity, of patriotism, of a defensive fear of invading enemies will bring people into the armies, will bring people into the factories. But in some senses, it was touch and go. That the politicians at the center and the majority of the population don't understand each other well. And that is a constant source of anger and tension right through the Terror and out the other side.
Well, do you mind if I ask you both a question about the Terror, or just about actions like the killing of the royal family? Is that an expression of anger, or is it justice? Is it a legal action? Is it terror itself, an angry, a product of anger and emotion, or sets of political calculations? How do you think about it in your research? Maybe start with Katie, please.
If we think about just the king for a moment and think about the charge against him, it's les nations, which literally means crimes against the nation. So that's the word for treason. But they actually had to change the word for treason because it used to be les majestés, crimes against the king. And so you have to figure out, what are we mad at this person for doing? Who has he betrayed, right? The crimes against, that's the betrayal, that's the anger. So while the killing of the king, he did conspire with the enemies that were attacking the country, right? It's pretty clear by most definitions of treason, he was committing treason. It's not just, it's really important about who feels that betrayal and who's part of that betrayal. So in some sense, it's, I think sometimes popular culture makes it out to be a little more vindictive than it was, because it was an actual trial. The killing of Marie Antoinette was more of a show trial with even accusations of incest. So that gets kind of into more of an emotional frenzy. But at least for the king, when they were first trying to establish questions like, can you try an executive officer of a government for betraying the government, which used to be a more hypothetical question. And then the question of like, so then what do you do with him? If he's outside the body politic, do you kill him? Do you exile him? What do you do with him? If he's not of us, how do you get rid of him? And that, again, is an old question, right? With the pollution of any early modern society, what do you do with the pollution, right? That's poisoning the whole body politic. So it changes. I guess the answer to your question is it changes with kind of the trajectory of the revolution, especially as the revolution radicalizes. Then kind of that judicial restraint goes by the wayside in many cases. And I bet David can talk a lot to that.
Well, I think, I mean, one of the interesting ways of approaching the process that ends up with the execution of the king is to think about how it's also actually connected to popular violence, to deaths, and to fear and anger about betrayal within the political class itself. Because I mean, the king is on trial at the end of 1792. He's executed in January 1793. A little way before that, I mean, the monarchy is overthrown in August of 1792, while enemy armies are marching on Paris. And one of the infamous responses to this is the September massacres, where a large number of prisoners in prison in Paris, about 15% of whom were actually sort of counter-revolutionary suspects, and the others were just common criminals. These people are put to death by groups of Parisian radical activists who might be characterized as crowds, but might not, because they have trial processes, they read the registers of the courts, they decide guilt and innocence. They don't execute at least half of the counter-revolutionary suspects they could have executed if they'd been indiscriminate. It's a very interesting, very complicated death-dealing process where, you know, they kill 1,500 people, but they could have killed 3,000 or 4,000, and you have to kind of position yourself like that. But one of the things that's also going on in that moment is that different factions within the Republican leadership, the newly Republican leadership, are blaming each other for everything that's gone wrong. People around Jacques-Pierre Brissot are going to blame people around Robespierre for the September massacres and for trying to have the people around Brissot killed in the September massacres. The people around Robespierre think that the people around Brissot were trying to protect the king, were trying to stop the overthrow of the monarchy, and then trying to stop putting him on trial and executing him. And they will generate a furious degree of mutual anger and hostility. Sort of by, again, the early spring of 1793, you have punch-ups in the new National Assembly, the National Convention, between these people. In the end, the Robespierrist faction will draw on its allies in the Parisian popular movement and purge the National Convention. Brissot and his allies will run away to the provinces and end up on the other side in what is really a civil war for much of the rest of 1793. That, you know, that one of that emblematic key moment, the deciding what to do with the king, can he live, must he die, is also tangled up with people's perceptions and fears of their own fate. Mm-hmm. The Brissotins think they were targeted for death in September 1792. And the Robespierrists and their supporters think that the Brissotins are targeting them for death 6 months later. And that fear and that anxiety and sense of betrayal, again, something I think we always have to come back to. There is always that sense that people are being, you know, not just opposed, but betrayed. And that is grounds for a righteous fury, which becomes death dealing in various forms.
So that even within the regime, the regime itself or the assembly itself could be, you know, both individual anger and collective anger contributes to violent episodes. So, you know, the American Revolution, I think the historians are just now really grappling with the level of violence in mobilization during the lead up to the revolution, but also the war itself, and what an incredibly violent event it was, and how people, you know, what a long event it was, which is true of the French Revolution too. I mean, with many stages, but it's, you know, it's a long event that many people are you know, have extremely traumatic experiences during. So both of you are now kind of looking at reconciliation and how people are sort of trying to get past or process some of that. So I wonder if, Katie, you would start, but both of you would talk a little bit about how you're thinking about these processes of social reconciliation and of restoring mutual trust and that idea of fraternity that is in the tricolor.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in how people experience, process, and kind of appropriate and make the revolution through their everyday life. So in my previous work, I used lots of justice of the peace records to look at marketplace disputes. And one of the things that absolutely was fascinating to me was like the proficiency with which people could use revolutionary discourse and logic to defend their own position, like they're 2 feet in the marketplace. So like, this is public domain. I'm part of the public. I have every right to be here on this public street. Like, these are people who are barely above the subsistence line and have made the switch, and that public domain is not the king's property. It's another public, and this is them. And so so that really got me thinking about how do they justify their actions? And of course, they're justice of the peace record, so they're often conflict. So then I started thinking, well, when the power to pardon is rests from the crown on the one hand, the king as the ultimate source of law, and the cross on the other hand, in kind of a sacramental sense, because the revolutionaries take over the church, how is kind of conflict resolution redistributed in new ways that reshape relations and kind of, we'll say aspire to reshape relations in fraternal ways. And so I'm doing that in a few ways. I'm looking at the Justice of the Peace records. There's a whole new set of procedures that the National Assembly invents called especially voluntary judgments, in which you don't have to sue one another finally to go to the Justice of the Peace, but it's not mediation, it's actually a judgment, but you negotiate with the judge what you want the resolution to be, and you don't have to pay to summon someone, you don't have to arrange like several weeks in advance. So the idea is that you use an institution of the state to basically foster what the National Assembly hoped were natural fraternal associations between people that just needed some kind of like institutional lubricant to move forward. So it doesn't always work like that. But basically, at the end of the day, I'm also looking at, what happens to how people conceptualize forgiveness when priests are all of a sudden elected, and there's a whole new debate over what forgiveness means in that sense. I'd like to look eventually at a group of kind of idealist theophilanthropists, lovers of God and man, their name literally means, and how they try to remake a religion that would include everyone in this fraternal embrace. And then even I would hope, if the book doesn't get too long, have a chapter on education, because the revolutionaries overhaul education. They have textbook competitions. And I'm really interested to see how the stories of how conflict in history is told, which are usually the source of many of these kind of spelling lessons and things like that, if they change in kind of their tenor in trying to promote this new society. So that's kind of where I'm at in my current inquiries.
I'm thinking at the moment about different aspects of trust as the revolutionaries work these things through. And as was mentioned earlier, one of the things I've been looking at recently is the attempts to invent a jury system, where one of the things I think is fascinating about that is the Revolutionary National Assembly from 1789 it sort of scares itself with the radicalism of what it's committed to. You find pronouncements in late 1789 that trial by jury is and has to be a foundation of the Constitution. This is what the nation wants. It must be happening. It's a fundamental transformation. And then when they try to work out what that means in practice, it frightens them that they might actually be giving the power of life and death to ordinary people who aren't qualified lawyers, who aren't judges. And you can read the debates, and they're literally talking about this as a kind of terrifying prospect, to actually entrust ordinary people with justice. And you get a lot of sort of paradoxical discussion, which it reminds you just how hierarchical was the social vision that still lived inside some of these people's heads as members of the National Assembly. Some of whom were still nobles and clergy when they'd been elected to it. So these justices of the peace that Katie's talking about, there's a widespread perception that this new form of justice is absolutely essential. And that the justice of the peace is someone who would be a trusted community person, valued pillar of the community, able to do this. And then they start thinking about other things. Well, maybe the justices of the peace should be the people who sort of remand people in custody for trial. Perhaps that should be one of the things they do. And then they just kind of, their heads explode and think, but he's not even a lawyer. How can he do that? He's just some pleb off the street. And so they have this sort of intermittent panic at the idea of actually radically changing anything. And what they will eventually do with the jury system is something which is quite extraordinary. They basically come to the position that because you can't expect these people to actually understand the law, because you can't expect them to actually reason on the basis of evidence, what we're going to do is turn the trial process into a sort of play. So everything is oral. The witnesses will be called together. They have to get interrogated in front of everyone else, in front of the defendant. The defendant is allowed to ask them questions and challenge them. So you literally turn an actual crime into a morality play, and then you expect the audience, the jury, to feel the right answer. Their sentiments, their emotions. This is a very late 18th century idea, that those sense impressions will affect them emotionally and tell them what the right answer is. They won't have to think about it. And you know, it's absolutely fascinating to try and explore this, that the revolution is sort of catapulting itself into a future it doesn't even want to understand, embarking on these kind of things. And they'll bring in this jury system, and it'll go on into the late 1790s. And then as the natural authoritarians start to crack down, as you start to move towards the Napoleonic system, they'll say these juries are rubbish. They keep acquitting people who shouldn't be acquitted, and we get rid of the jury system. But the really interesting thing is some other recent research that someone has done, digging into these jury trials in the late 1790s, say, well, actually, it worked. You know, well, statistically, at least, they didn't either acquit or condemn statistically wildly differently from what other kind of courts were doing. So systematically, you can say it worked. It was kind of crazy, but it worked. And the French will end up going back to this oral confrontation system later in the 19th century. And they're literally only in the last 2 or 3 years moving away from it, moving away from jury trial for a lot of criminal trials. It's this extraordinary persistence of an idea that was sort of both madly radical and yet also very much distrusting of the ordinary people actually on the jury. So there's a really interesting sort of historical entanglement going on there.
Well, that is interesting, both because of my own obsessions, obviously, with American history. I mean, being a juror was one of the political activities that was open to, that more people engage in than voting at some level, or holding political office and everything. So, you know, kind of an important training for political activity. I think that your discussion of the creating of these, you know, emotional emotional courts, that this was an older model. At the same time, it's sort of a bridge to romantic essentialism of the 19th century, it seems like, to a certain extent, or certainly the Jacksonian democracy is built on this notion of the emotional intelligence of ordinary people, that they're capable of. They don't need rationality if we can rely on emotional intelligence, which has lots of implications for race and racialized ideology too. But that's not a bad segue to thinking a little bit about citizenship and how all of the things you're talking about, both the crowd actions, the political activity, the creation of new kinds of bonds amongst people, that not based on the old corporate orders. But why is the vote restricted so much then? You know, so in other words, how does all this activity, emotion, anger, protest, not lead to a citizenship that's based on a kind of an idea of the public will, a very collective expression, as opposed to more individualized expression?
Well, I would say that everyone's supposed to tap into the general will to like understand the collective common good, so that it's not the tyranny of the majority. But the revolutionaries preface that ability to tap into the general will on your autonomy. And so that shakes down to several different factors of autonomy, because under the old regime, everyone is subjugated to someone in the hierarchy, right? So in the social hierarchy of feudalism, right? Peasants under the nobles under, you know, the king. So no one's autonomous, right? The king's the only one that's autonomous, kind of, because he's doing God's mandate. So there's like this notion that the citizen has to be autonomous so that he's not doing someone else's private will, particular will, the French would say, but that he's able to tap into the general will. And so what this means is that servants, for example, can't vote, right? They're dependents of someone else. If you're a man, you must make at least 3 days, pay at least 3 days wages and taxes at the beginning of the revolution, so that you show kind of you're not economically dependent on someone else. Eventually, you need to be a head of household, so that's going to exclude women as well. But it's really this focus on autonomy, and that's sometimes I think where well, I would argue, and I think many other recent historians would argue that we get tripped up with women are excluded from citizenship, and it's actually not women are excluded from citizenship, as Anne Verjus has put so eloquently. It's women plus all dependent men. So it's just dependent people, are people coded as dependent, that end up getting excluded from citizenship. So that's how I perceive the transition.
I think, I mean, there's some interesting other dimensions to that to think about. I mean, there is this sense that the voter should be, as you say, autonomous, independent in their judgment, but also, for example, they should also be grounded. They should be grounded in a community that at least a year's domicile, as they call it, is a requirement for voting all the way through into the period of the Terror, which is interesting because domicile in kind of 18th century terms is a marker of respectability. It's not just whether you physically inhabit a space, it's whether you are embedded in that community. And there are a lot of people in Paris all through the 18th century who are not dans le meuble. They're not in their furniture. They don't have a proper home that they live in. They're in rented rooms or anything, and they're not domiciled. So built into this idea that someone should be independent, there is also the idea that they should be grounded and rooted, and they can't just be a free floating thing. One of the things they're arguing about in 1789 is whether whether people like merchants aren't a bit dangerous to let people like that vote, because they can just up sticks and move away. It should be someone who's committed to the community. But the other side of this, when we think about citizenship, is that again, one doesn't realize this until one really digs into what they were constructing. Is they're constructing something in which almost nobody actually has any autonomy at all. That from village mayors upwards, what people are supposed to be is administrators. The only people who have sort of political initiative are the ones who are actually elected to the National Assembly. They are, and again, there's a lot of sort of internalized metaphysics going on here. Those individuals, 600 or 700 of them, get to be the general will, get to be the spirit of the nation, as if by magic. Everyone else, tens of thousands of other people who occupy elected positions in this revolutionary bureaucracy, village, town, district, department, and so on, they are administrators. They are bound to obedience, to tutelle, to oversight from the level above them. And it's a pyramid that literally goes all the way up to the king. The king and the council of ministers, and then the departments and so on, they literally, written into law, have oversight of what the people below them do, and they can veto anything that they shouldn't be doing. So the village mayor is supposed to not do anything that isn't in his kind of written instructions without referring to higher authority. So the idea of citizenship they're actually creating early in the revolution, and that they don't really change all the way through the 1790s, is one where being a citizen is more a form of service than a kind of freedom. That the freedom and the equality and everything else that they imagine all comes through kind of burying yourself in an abstraction called the nation, in serving the nation, doing a constitutional duty. There is no space for political contestation. You're not supposed to disagree with what comes down from the center under pretty much any circumstances, because at the center is where legitimate political decisions get taken. And every few years, if you're lucky, you get to participate in sending someone to become part of that process. But once you've done that, everything else is about obeying the law. And my friend Jill Maysett Walshaw wrote a very interesting book looking at the literally thousands of bits of paper that were sent to individual villages in 91, 92, 93, telling them what to do, to the point where a lot of villages just didn't bother reading it anymore because they couldn't. But that's the vision of kind of an administrative hierarchy that they'd quite explicitly set up, that the centre just told everyone what to do.
And I would add to that, the vision of citizenship, kind of David and I have been talking about, is obviously that of the parliamentary deputies, right? And so the people who, there was no blueprint for citizenship. Everyone's making it up as they go along. And so even people that end up outside of official voting rights, if they can tap into the language of service and reciprocal duties, you can locate the nation in other groups of people that you're serving. So for example, the market woman I studied said, you have to give us usable space in the marketplace because we do a public service. We serve the nation because we give food to people and then they can eat. And so that's our contribution. And so now, state, I can demand on you that you make space available to me to do this service to the nation. So you kind of have the social contract going that can sometimes have a third leg between citizens among each other, and then they're saying, oh, that's how we participate in the nation. That's outside of this parliamentary kind of schema of institutionalized voting that sometimes will get recognition from the state and kind of legitimacy in a state response in the affirmative.
Well, this has all been a fascinating discussion. I've taken so many notes and lots that I'll incorporate into my own research. But I see there's a question in the queue, and I think it's actually a good thing to kind of return to. And it is asking, to paraphrase, how is the way that you two scholars are using history of emotion and thinking about anger in your work different from an earlier generation or two? Thinking about Charles Tilley or thinking about E.P. Thompson, some of these other folks that had written about crowds and anger and emotion. So what do you think is different about how is thinking about history of emotions now maybe affecting the scholarship in different ways? Or how might you view yourselves as departing from or building on these earlier historical uses?
In some ways right now, we think about crowd mentality, and I'm trying not to think about the mentality of a crowd in a specific time and place, but how mentalities can change across the popular classes more broadly through intensely personal experiences. So for me, one of the central themes in my work right now is how can, forgiveness, how can conflict resolution be both a break on personal conflict between two individuals and a motor for societal-wide change in how we think about how we're supposed to interact with each other on a very personal level that has political purchase if we're trying to create a fraternal nation. So, that has everything to do with feelings and ability to get beyond, you don't have to feel like someone's your best friend, but you do have to have a level of respect that restores working relationships, right? And so I'm really interested in how the revolutionary state tries to facilitate that in different ways to kind of create a new kind of fraternally motivated society, one that's not so confrontational and contested, even in like the very granular interactions of everyday life.
Katie, are they thinking about governability or more about other things that can substitute that are not angry, like commerce or things like that? I mean, are they theorizing around emotion as part of that in some sense in terms of policy?
Yeah, they're mostly thinking about if everyone has a duty to the nation, right? On some way, people are emotionally equal, right? So they tend to think about people in different judicial categories by the type of conflict they may have instead of the type of person they are now. So for example, commercial courts will remain to have their own special law, but disputes, even if they're economic among people who aren't two merchants, can be settled in a different venue that's appropriate to kind of the emotional register in which they may have to continue to engage in non-commercial transactions, right? So maybe a more friendly local court rather than a merchant court that's more centralized, kind of sterile. They don't know the judge. So that's kind of how they're trying to think about it. And they're trying to make it pragmatic because the revolutionaries have enough conflict, right? Especially when they start fighting most of Europe. They just need things at home to go well. So it's also very pragmatic. It is idealized, and it has far-reaching effects. I won't get into them here, but one of my chapters kind of looks how this system accidentally rethinks credit, because it allows people for the first time to settle their small debts for like $1 or $2, we'll say, in court. And so for the first time in history, people can choose, do I treat my transactions with my retailer different than I treat my personal loan with friends? And the answer is yes. And it totally transforms the world of credit without the deputies intending to do that at all. They just want to solve conflict, period. So people take this ability, this tool, to kind of reshape their personal relationships in kind of transformative ways that will have ramifications into the 19th century.
Oh, you're really going to have to tell me more about the personal credit stuff, Katie, because that absolutely ties into the kind of trust things that I'm interested in.
And then actually, and I want David to weigh in on this, but in the meantime, people put questions in the question queue or email questions to our organizer, Sarah Butler, or if you have any questions or queries, please make sure you put them in the queue so we can have the speakers address them. But sorry to interrupt, David. Go ahead.
No problem. No, I was just going to segue then to the question about people like Roudet, people like Thompson. I mean, this is really kind of understanding and thinking about the historiographical context they're working in. I mean, as the introduction to Roudet's Crowd in the French Revolution makes very clear, he's set out to rehabilitate the individuals who are in the crowd from a complete 19th century conservative demonization, that they're both irrational and corrupt, and that's at the core of his mission. And that book very successfully demonstrates there's no evidence that the crowds are either particularly irrational or at all corrupt, that they're ordinary people caught up in revolutionary affairs, pursuing agendas that they see as important around them. I think that what the work of those kind of generation of people in the 50s and 60s, and you would include, I think, also the work of Albert Sabul on the sans-culottes about this, is they weren't particularly interested in the complexity of the culture that revolutionary actors came out of. The Albert Sabul's vision of the artisan milieu, for example, that the sans-culottes famously come from, is very schematic. It doesn't account for what we now know about really complicated interlocking structures of conflict and loyalty and self-expression between master craftsmen, journeymen, apprentices. It's really interesting, really complicated. There's men and women involved, all sorts of levels, fascinating stuff. They just didn't know any of that. So you get a vision of the revolution kind of exploding into people's lives and giving them politics. Whereas I think now what a lot of historiography would focus on was understanding that people already had quite complicated political relations to their households, neighbors, workmates, the public authorities, and that their revolutionary experience is about translating the self-assertion that came from having those previous politics into new circumstances, into new ideas, into new vocabularies. And it's fascinating, for example, in 1791, when the authorities want to sort of prohibit trade unions or anything that looks like a trade union. They want to ban it all. And you see workers' groups mobilizing and using languages which are simultaneously corporatist and revolutionary. There's an organization, I think it's the printers, it's the core of typographers, who publish this thing which is the demands of the General Assembly, which is revolutionary language, of the core of typographers, which is pre-revolutionary language. And they're blending both languages together to say, we are workers and we have rights. And again, the ironic thing is the revolutionary authorities say, no, you don't, shut up. And the loi Le Chapelier against trade unions will stay on the books for decades afterwards. And again, that's that idea of the revolution flinging itself into the future and then dragging itself back to more socially conservative places. But that kind of complexity is what wasn't really being picked up by those earlier generations, who tended to assume that sort of politics was injected into people from outside, from above, in that way.
All right, a couple more questions have come in. We have a question, one question about whether saying that in the 17th century, men often pushed women forward to express their anger, believing, often correctly, that forces of order would show more restraint against them. So do you see this happening in the later French Revolution?
I think definitely you see it in the political pamphlets and the stylized voices of the people that pamphleteers who are not of the popular classes are taking. For example, there's a 18th century literary genre called the genre poissarde, literally the genre of the fishwives. And it takes the stereotypical marketplace woman who is boisterous, gritty, rough, frank as all get up, in your face, not afraid to say her opinion, and like very loud and funny, because she is so emotionally hypercharged, like way above the normal bar of emotional regulation for a circumstance. But because of that, they become very popular characters in pamphlets, because people appropriate that character in order to make a point that's very emotional about how unfair is this situation, and can't the king see what's going on? I mean, I'm a dumb fishwife and I can see what's going on, so surely the rest of the population can. So it gets definitely used in propaganda a lot. I don't, and David maybe has other examples. I don't see it as much kind of in street activism, at least from what I've seen, where they try to push women to the front. It's more that women have already taken that initiative, oftentimes in marketplace situations. There's certainly crowds are certainly willing to rally behind women as moral guardians of the community, that's for sure. But as far as like a protect the crowd, the king won't fire type deal, that's not really. I can't think of any examples of that. What do you think, David?
No, I think, I mean, it's one of the things that was said for a long time about the October days, that this is one of the things that lying behind it is the possibility of this kind of continuity. But I think most of the evidence that you're familiar with suggests that this is much more of a kind of genuine impulse from consumers and salespeople in the marketplace. I think it's interesting to reflect that. I mean, the revolutionary authorities, the radical revolutionary authorities, are deeply distrustful of women at a whole series of levels. You know, and we've already talked about those incidents in 1791 with what one of the journalists called the punishment of the anti-constitutional buttocks of these women. And you can push ahead right into the depths of the terror. I mean, the work of Olwyn Houghton particularly stands out on this, on just demonstrating just how vigorously radical revolutionaries, Republicans, hated women who opposed them. So they invent a whole sort of vocabularies of denigration to use against these priest-ridden harridans who make their life misery. You know, attacking them physically, swearing at them, showing them their buttocks, dangling from church bell ropes, getting in the way. There is a whole process of confrontation between significant groups of women in the countryside, in small towns, who see what radical republicanism is in 1793-94 as a completely alien agenda. You know, for whatever reason they do that, they're willing to oppose it. They're willing to oppose it physically and verbally. But you know, in that sense, they're putting themselves against the revolution, putting their bodies on the line, which is the complete opposite of that idea that putting a woman somewhere is almost, you know that there's something protects her. You know, the revolutionaries were quite happy to guillotine women just as much as men, often for similar no reason at all, particularly by the spring of 1794.
And to just add a point of clarity to David, a comment about women in the radical phase, women are thought to be more religious by nature and more perhaps loyal to the Catholic Church, which is one of the reasons why during the height of the terror, women especially become suspect in the countryside, because that's where the counter-revolutionary priests might be hiding out. And it's the women who, in some cases, are shielding them, but in other cases are just suspected of shielding them because they tend to be more kind of religiously engaged than their husbands.
Thanks for that answer. We had a question from Abby Starr, who says there's no one protests quite like the French, but also wants to know whether you think at all about the ongoing, does this sort of frame a kind of French political culture of, she's thinking of the Yellow Vests, and the French farmer protests and other sorts of more contemporary protests. Do you see this sort of framing a political culture moving forward, or do you not really view it as unique to the French? But did you want to weigh in whether this cause for this call to cause and this feeling, this use of emotion becomes integral to French society and politics after the revolution?
Go on, Katie, you first.
Oh, me first. Thanks, David. Well, I really hesitate to make huge jumps to the Yellow Vests because we have had a few centuries in between and like the lifespan of the United States. So it's kind of a long way away. But I would say that intensity of this idea that you are engaged in politics and that politics should resonate in your everyday life, and that you as a citizen should try to think about how history has played out in your nation is, I feel, not from a scientific standpoint, but just from interacting with French colleagues and having lived in France for a while, is much more present in France than the US. There is a sense of history deeply imbued in lots of things, and a sense of tradition. And I don't mean conservative tradition, but just of political engagement and in thinking about these things and in wrestling with these things. And, you know, there's lots of popular magazines and television shows and just a whole plethora of kind of continual historical and but tied to political engagement. How do we deal with these things? And Pamela Pilbeam, I just saw the announcement on H France, David, just wrote a book called The Revolting French, which she's trying to trace the first 100 years after the revolution to look at the legacy of the revolution. And unsurprisingly, with all the revolutions of the 19th century and revolts, you know, that is one of the legacies, right? We throw up the barricades, people try to get involved in politics. So I think there is definitely a French thrust to it. How clear I want to make some kind of theme between different specific protests, I'll let David take that one.
Right.
Or could I just follow up and ask both, ask before, and David, you could answer this too. Is it part of the memory of the French Revolution though? Is it sort of how it's memorialized and thought about by French people in the present? So, David.
I think that is one of the things that we're seeing when we think about what we're looking at today, is the more than half a century since 1968 is part of what we're seeing today. And using the French Revolution, using the idea of Republican values that go back to the 1790s to talk about what's happening today, it has a long-term history, but it also has that slightly short, medium-term history of how France has wrestled with its own identity over the last half century. I think you can think about sort of ebbs and flows in that approach and interest in what the revolution means. And obviously there's a massive mid-19th century period from around 1830 to around 1870, where a kind of revolutionary insurrectionary tradition draws on the first revolution, but it draws on it, over that gap that is Napoleon, that is the Restoration. It's already kind of a historical memory to the people involved in 1830 or 1848, and they're making their own memories. Their own Nietzschean eternal return, their own second time as farce, all these kind of things that commentators at the time and since have seen. It's a repertoire that they learn and they repeat. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And then it goes into abeyance for decades. You have a very different landscape in the later 19th century, where, you have very, very violent industrial disputes, strikes, crowds, people being gunned down by the authorities. And on the other side of that, you have anarchist bombers, you have ideological terrorism, which is nothing to do with the terror. It's completely different use of the word. It means something completely different. And the politics of the early 20th century are different again. The politics of the late Third Republic, the politics of experiencing Vichy and coming out of all of that, they all have they're very different lessons that they teach the people who live through them. But of course, you know, one of the things about believing yourself to be a nation is you can always make what you like out of the national past. God knows some very strange people in Britain have been trying to do that over the last decade or so. And France is obviously currently caught up in the sense that, you know, on the one hand, it is possible and in some senses legitimate to demonstrate extremely violently for all sorts of things. On the other hand, the authorities will always respond with extreme violence. You know, and this, you know, in 1968, they're chanting CRS, SS. You know, the Gaullist authorities were extremely violent in 1968. They still are now. What French political culture now does is to accept that possibility of really violent confrontation in a way which I think English political culture doesn't, certainly. I mean, American political culture, I think it kind of depends what color the skin is of the people who are protesting as to how far violence is meted out to them. There's a whole ball game there that we didn't get into. But, you know, there's an extreme variability from one nation to another about how far you expect politics to have a violent edge. And certainly since 1968, the French have used the idea of revolution, the heritage of Republican values that go back to the 1790s to mediate where that violent edge of politics is and where it should be. But they end up at a more violent place, certainly than a lot of their neighbors have.
And I would just say also, I mean, there's no, it's no coincidence that many of the Paris demonstrations try to start or end at Place de la République, the place of the Republic, right? The Republic. This is the message of the Republic. There's a website you can go to, I think, is it Paris Manif, to see where the manifestations are for the week, the political protests and the parade routes, right? I mean, this is something totally foreign. I'm sure there's not like a New York City website that tells you all the political protest parade routes. So there's also kind of this normalization of engagement, even, you know, when violence isn't present, that definitely is, I could see tied back to kind of the revolutionary spirit of crowd participation.
Well, we had two other questions hanging out there. And one is related to what we're just talking about. So maybe I will start with that, but maybe save a little time for a question about constitutions. So we had a question about representations of the French Revolution and its violence, and both at the time and since then. Is that a place where the kind of memory of violence lingers, as in artistic representations or other sorts of memorializations, or do you think there's maybe a desire to deliberately forget some of the violence? I mean, I think there certainly is in the context of the American Revolution. I'm always struck by, but the French Revolution, it is held up as the, you know, as the violent revolution, though. You know, I feel like very, very strongly in historiography. I don't know if that's true in French historiography, whether they view their revolution as uniquely violent in a comparative perspective.
I think even for contemporary French historiography, there's a necessary understanding that the scope of the violence that takes place, as it were, within the hexagon is exceptional. You know, the things like the Vendéan Civil War, I mean, are still very highly contested at an ideological level over what exactly happened and why. But one thing that there is a movement towards consensus on is that, you know, these are events with a significant six-figure death toll in the space of less than a year, and that's only one part of what was going on at the time. And, you know, I mean, it's possible to make other arguments. It's possible to look at the American Revolution and the war and the subsequent exiling of the Tories and so on, and say, well, you know, proportionate to the population, these are events of equal order of magnitude. But in the French case, you are dealing unquestionably with hundreds of thousands of general casualties, tens of thousands of arbitrary execution by military commission, thousands of people formally tried and guillotined, many of them on charges which are ludicrous on their face. You know, and that's one of the things that you always find yourself wrestling with, is that, particularly in May, June, July 1794, the things that people were being executed for in Paris were absurd. They were nonsense. They're fictions invented by spies planted in the prison who are just accusing people of things to save their own necks. And the attempt to sort of both demonize and de-demonize that is always going to make these very kind of very contentious events very significant, and objects of contestation, I think, forever. You can't have a general consensus on what this means. These are fundamentally ideologically divisive events and situations.
Well, they have their national anthem, which is is
that is
leaves it out there, leaves a little bit of that violence
shame.
out there. So I don't think they're entirely keeping it hidden.
So there are people who would say they should get rid of that anthem because it's shameful to be talking about violence like that, and they come from different points on the political spectrum.
Yep. Well, we have a question from Vince, who's sort of interested in how on the impact of the very early stages of the French Revolution on America and its constitution writing, and if there was if people were paying attention in 1787, 1788 to what's going on in France. But you couldn't even broaden your responses to that question and think a little bit about and a little bit about the about influence either in America or on other revolutions. You can sort of take that question how you want to. Vince, I'd say that, I think some people, including Gordon Wood, is not a flaming radical, view the Constitution as a bit of a thermidor, as in other words, a reaction to violence in the form of Shays' Rebellion and court closings, or, crowd anger, a reaction to that. And a desire to take the revolution in a slightly more conservative direction. So that's actually very, that idea has been around for decades and isn't necessarily very controversial. And I think the framers sort of talked about it too. But I don't know if our panelists have any thoughts about thinking about how the early stages of the French Revolution, influenced that larger age of revolution.
And I'm Team Daniel Shays, me. I mean, all those reactionaries at Philadelphia should have been stopped. I think it's really interesting that the simultaneity of these is fascinating. Obviously, the Philadelphia Convention meets in 87, at the same time almost as France is having its Assembly of Notables, which is one of the things that kicks off the revolution. And I think Ben Franklin actually refers to the Philadelphia Convention as an Assembly of Notables because he knows that these parallels are going on. The Bill of Rights and the French Declaration of Rights will be being discussed almost literally simultaneously in August of 1789. So in that sense, it's very difficult for one to influence the other because they're happening at the same time 3,000 miles apart. Obviously, the easy question is American influence on France, because we know that whole group of people who came over with Lafayette, in many cases, very, very senior members of the aristocracy, are fascinated intellectually by the language of American state constitutions, by the notion of the Declaration of Rights that are in them. Lafayette has his famous empty frame up on his wall for a French Declaration of Rights. Trying to work that backwards from France to America, it involves, a time turner of a certain kind. But Katie, if you want to have a go at that one.
Yeah. Well, I'm not as obviously versed in the American side of things, but I would say if we're thinking about kind of a less elite perception, but popular perception, there's like a celebrity around, Ben Franklin and Tom Paine, because people are excited in France that their ideas like resonate with other areas of the world, and that other ideas from other areas of the world can resonate with them, because there's the universality that the French are looking for, right? Can there be anything more universal than a citizen that's like cosmopolitan, that's not even French? So isn't it like, Tom Paine doesn't even speak a word of French, does he?
Not really.
Yeah. No. And so, but he's like in the National Assembly and everyone's so excited because it's about the shared spirit of the law. The one thing I always do talk about with my students, though, is that the French kind of seem to take some take note of the American case and saying, you know, when we write our Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, we just need like a starting point. Like this isn't like a correction to something. We like don't even know where to start. And so that is a really formative document for the French in a way that's different from the Bill of Rights, because the French are just trying to establish what are the goals of government. So the Bill of Rights is like super important in the American context, but I think in the French context, because they're trying to do something so radical, they're trying to overhaul like the structure of society and politics, that they're like, we've got to get this right from the start. It has to be, we need a starting point and it has to be right. So that kind of that dialogue with American influence is just so important at the start of the revolution, to be like, we just need some principles and they have to be solid and well tried.
Although, I mean, the other interesting thing about the French Declaration is, read from a certain angle, it's a one-page distillation of the Cahiers de Doléances.
Yes, that's true.
All the things that are wrong with the old regime that we're not going to do, and that's 90% of it. You know, so they've just turned those into general principles, but they're like, it's just not doing stuff that we didn't like before. But that's a fair place to start, after all.
We know what we don't like, not what we like yet.
It is a fair place to start. Well, I think I think we've done a pretty good job of covering this topic, and you've given everybody so much food for thought and so many things to consider. I've really appreciated hearing from both these great scholars and from the great questions that our audience offered. So I think we'll let them go, and we'll end our program. But let's give them, you know, some live and virtual applause.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
very much.
participating. And that concludes our program for today.